when you want your boredom gone and you don't want to wait too long on the immediate murder professionals. I know that everyone in their hellhound has talked about this series already, but you know what? It's worth the discussion. Vivzipop's answer to The Office, Helluva Boss is one hell of a ride. Not only carried by simultaneously intriguing and dramatic stories, but also by its lovable cast and insurmountably bold charisma. Each episode offers something similar in charm and execution, but different in concept and story. So, why not count down my top 5 favorite Helluva Boss episodes? Before we begin though, a few heads up. First, I won't be including the pilot episode because even though it is another episode of the show, it doesn't have an episode or season number, so I'm disqualifying it. Second, this video is going to contain major story spoilers, so if you haven't seen the series yet and want to check it out for yourself, please close out of this and go watch it. Which brings us to 3. I'm ranking these episodes based on their narratives and character moments. That's it. I know Helluva Boss is technically a comedy and I should probably put more emphasis on the humor, but let's be real, the drama is the main appeal for most of the fans, including myself. I'm also not taking into account the animation or music because literally every episode has amazing animation and outstanding musical numbers. They don't need to be explained because they screech for themselves. To any animators or musicians who worked on this show watching this, I have one thing to say to you. Holy fudging shut. You're talented, absolutely no doubt about it. And finally, 4. This list is just my personal opinion. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong about my ranking, I'm just saying it's what I feel like are the best episodes. So please, don't get upset with me over this. Plus, literally every episode is a good time at least, and an emotional roller coaster at most. I'm not saying that any episodes which aren't on this list are bad, I'm just saying which ones I think are the best of the best. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get right into this hellhole, shall we? Guys, I have a confession. I stopped watching the show halfway through. I know, I feel bad about it, especially since every episode is so good. I didn't watch the finale to season 1 because I thought it was a 2-parter, and that I would just wait for the next one to come out, and then, you know what? I shouldn't be making excuses. Although, while I can say that I regretted that choice, I can't say I regret which episode I left on. Who knew the SCP Foundation could infiltrate other IPs? To tell the truth, Truth Seekers is probably one of the best episodes to showcase the relationship between Blitz and Moxie. Before we get to the scene/musical number though, I want to get a few minor things out of the way. First, this episode has a unique concept. I'm sure my opinion probably isn't that original, but I see Helluva Boss as a sort of villain of the week kind of show, in that every episode has a different or reoccurring opponent for the team to face. A lot of the other villains the gang face don't want the team getting in their way or only attack when provoked, and most of their motivations involve either revenge or trying to do a job that the gang interferes with. I feel like Thing 1 and Thing 2 and the other Dork Foundation members are unique among the rogue gallery, and that they're the ones who pursue and harm the imps this time, and how it's up to the imps to escape the situation rather than prolong the conflict. I think they were a simple but effective subversion of the usual baddies the imps face, and seeing how the situation plays out in this reverse-engineered setup was a pretty cool change of pace and formula. It's also nice that their story ends on a cliffhanger, making it perfectly clear that they will return in future episodes. Moving on from that, this is definitely one of the more action-oriented episodes, and the action here is, I might argue, the best in the series. I like to think it's the best because of the creativity and character the awesome violence utilizes. Creativity because it uses a lot of different weapons and gags, and character because every member of IMP gets a chance to brawn and show how cool and strong they are. Granted, I do think the guards only using weapons from Japan's Edo period was kind of a forced way to include creative combat, but the Foundation was made up of dorks, so I'll let it slide. Plus, while, like I said, all the animation in this show is impressive, I feel like the crew really went all out and tried to go the extra mile in this one, specifically with the rotating shots of the interrogation room as the imps fight the agents. Is it possible for your eyes to pee themselves from excitement? Because mine sure did. Oh, wait, that's just crying, isn't it? Well, anyway, finally, there's the drama between Blitz and Moxie. And yeah, I feel like it was handled really well here. Due to an airborne truth-telling syrup, Moxie and Blitz both experience hallucinations where they're forced to reflect on their actions and confront some of their more harmful character traits. While Moxie learns that he should try to be more confident in his abilities and honest with Blitz, Blitz is forced to admit to his self-destructive social behaviors in fear of dying alone. When I first watched this, I thought that Blitz's scenes were a lot deeper than Moxie's, mainly because his parts undeniably looked cooler. Seriously, how is the animation so good? But after rewatching this episode, I think that they both deserve credit for their respective character moments. They both learned something in this episode that related to who they were and how to improve themselves with the knowledge they gained. The scene at the end where Blitz compliments Moxie really ties both of their arcs together and shows that while they're nearly complete opposites, they actually have a lot in common in terms of how they feel about themselves, and that they're kind of perfect for helping each other out with their respective problems. Friends can be found in the least likeliest of places sometimes, including literal demons. Altogether, Truth Seekers is just a really solid episode that manages to have both energetic fun and deep character-driven drama. Not to mention the buckets of charm too. A perfect showcase of what this show is made of. Man, am I lucky to have stopped here. Only, now I've seen the whole series as of now and know what the other episodes are like. Speaking of which, even though Helluva Boss takes place in the literal underworld and plays it for laughs, it's not afraid to treat serious issues with respect. Mainly, this show gets serious in how it tackles mental problems and how damaging they can be to life. The most obvious example being Blitz and Stolas, but hang on, we're not there yet. Soon though, soon. For now, I want to focus on Moxie in the episode that shows why he has that name the most, and not just because of his family. Lights! Action! It is showtime! X's and O's isn't necessarily the biggest episode this show has to offer, but it is definitely one of the most dramatic ones. And that's saying a lot, because every other episode of this show is already pretty fudging dramatic. First, the concept. For a quick summary, in this episode we find out that Moxie's father is actually a mafia boss, and the gang gets invited over for dinner at his place, along with Moxie and Millie's shared ex, this washed up SpongeBob OC named Chaz. I kind of feel like this episode didn't take that much advantage over the premise. Don't get me wrong, I still thought it was pretty rad that the writers decided to do a mafia story, but the mafia stuff feels more like a way to explain why Moxie is the way he is and to propel the conflict of the episode. We don't actually see the mafia committing that many crimes, although to be completely honest, this probably just boils down to personal taste, as I was hoping that the episode was going to end in a big heist or shootout with a rival gang or something. It's what we got. The premise does lead to both an interesting mystery and a really energized and fast climax by this show's standards. Again, how is the animation this good? Moving on, I thought this episode had a lot of good character moments. Of course, there's the one-time villain Chaz and his eccentric personality, and while I wouldn't call his character that original, he does have a lot of good moments that make him stand out among the other villains. You really can tell from his scenes that he's nothing but a shallow bully. Yet the sharp writing of this episode still makes him really fun to watch, although it kind of bites this episode in its wedding dress butt with some of its other elements, but we'll get to that in a minute. Then there's Blitz, and I feel like his personality really shines in this episode, mainly with how he reacts to everything going on around the house. Plus, it helps that he's mainly treated as comic relief in this episode, which leads to the drama with Millie and, oh man, Moxie in this episode. Just, wow. Okay, first of all, his backstory. Before this, we already knew about Millie's loving parents and Blitz's exploitative father, but we had never really known what Moxie's family or childhood was like. I don't think anyone was expecting what we got. Unlike Blitz's father, who was presented as a bad person but in a comedic, unserious light, Crimson is not a joke or an unnoteworthy plot device. Crimson is portrayed as a genuine monster who is willing to hurt anyone to get what he wants. I feel like the flashback to Moxie's childhood really does sell just how much of an evil scumbag he really is. And that moment at the lake, man, that was dark. Here, Moxie's fear of his father feels completely justified, and watching him finally stand up to his old man for once in his life is really satisfying and inspiring. Unfortunately though, this does lead to an unintended consequence of the episode having tonal whiplash. And I feel like the comedy of this episode doesn't really mesh well with how serious the story was. That's not to say this show can only be one or the other, but still. It was a bit off-putting to have the same episode about Moxie's abusive and straight-up psychopathic father also have Chaz singing about how attractive he is. It was a little weird, but it still didn't subtract from the story this episode offers, which frankly feels like one of the more genuinely edgy plots this show has tackled so far. X's and O's isn't too different from just another episode of Helluva Boss, but it definitely has one of the most interesting and dark stories to make up for that. Altogether, I do think it's clear that there are better episodes, but I don't think any of them have ever gotten as serious as this one did, at least in its main plot. Well, that choice of words is not going to bode well for the rest of the list. Alright, I've held off on it long enough, but I know you're all waiting for that one character, so here you go.
Oh, well, everybody's heard about the bird. Bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner, well, a bird, bird, bird. Bird is a winner, well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a winner, well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner, well, a...
I'd never forgive myself if I played anything else there. I know a lot of the more negative discussion around this show comes from Solus and, more specifically, his relationship with Blitz. I'm not going to act like the relationship is the worst one ever written, but I can see its flaws, mainly in how it's somewhat undercooked and a big focus of the show, especially in the later seasons, yet progresses slower than a snail using Internet Explorer. With that said though, I do think that it is a well-written relationship. I mean, I have seen better love stories before, but this one is still a better love story than... oh, I can't think of the name, but it's better than that. I see the relationship as simply a natural and realistic one. As realistic as a relationship between a former clown turned assassin and a magic prince in an arranged marriage are anyway. But still, I feel like the interactions between them make sense and that they're both trying to make their situations work for them, even if they have different ideas of what exactly work means. I'll go into more detail about why I like the relationship in the next entry, but for now, I'm feeling fancy. You'd better get a date for this one, because we're going to Aussies. The staff is pretty rude, but the wine is incredible. To be fair, I don't see Aussies as just an episode about Blitz and Stolas, even though their plot is a big part of it. But I see it belonging just as much to Moxie and Millie too. Let's just cut to the chase this time. This episode is absolutely carried by its musical number and slightly carried by who's singing it. While Fizzaroli feels like a bit of a downgrade from his last appearance, in that he doesn't really have a big impact on the story and serves more of a henchman role this time, I can't act like I wasn't happy to see him again. The combination of his elastic, rubber hose-ish animation combined with his brutal honesty and mild insanity really made him fun to watch in not only this episode but in Lululand too. Even though that technically wasn't Fizzaroli, but still. Then of course there's the big bad of this episode, Ozzy himself. There's his design, which I can see as appealing to some, but for me personally, it's a little too over-designed. I mean, a lot of the characters are also a little over-designed, and frankly I love how most of them look, but here I feel like it was an instance where the artists went just a little overboard on the details. In terms of who Ozzy is as a character, I don't really feel like he has a strong personality either, especially compared to the other villains this show has. But similar to Chaz, you really can tell that he's just a complete jerk from his first lines alone. Even then, I don't think his simplistic personality really subtracts from the song here, which, like I said, is the main event of this episode. I feel like it's not just about what's actually sung, but also how it's set up. To summarize, Moxie took Millie to Aussies for their first anniversary, with Blitz watching them in secret while on a date with Stolas. During that night, Moxie decided to perform her live song in front of an audience for Millie. Pretty wholesome, right? Well, unfortunately, Fizzaroli and Ozzy disagree, and upstaged his happy marriage with their own song about how sentimental love blows and how lust is so much better. If you two want to give terrible relationship advice, go write a book about it, you JT Dog Zone wannabes! While there had been instances where the imps got insulted before, this is the first time one of them got personally embarrassed and mocked in front of a crowd. That's not to say the scene here isn't just effective because Moxie's getting humiliated, but it's why he's getting humiliated that makes it memorable. He just wanted to sing a song for his wife, on their anniversary, and got punished for it? What kind of place is this? Well, it's literally hell, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But still! And if you think Aussie's Punished Land ends there, I'm sorry, but you're sorely mistaken, because then Blitz and Stolas get roped into it too. Not only does Blitz get annihilated by Fizzerati and Veronica exposing his awful dating life and selfish personality to a live audience, but Stolas gets called out for dating Blitz rather than being loyal to his wife. I feel like this episode really brought to light a side of Stolas that the show doesn't acknowledge that much, and that his affair with Blitz is just that, an affair, and everything that comes with it. Before this episode, the relationship between Stolas and Blitz was treated as something that's a little weird but ultimately a pure good for Stolas. But Ozzy really did acknowledge that what Stolas did really was a legitimate sin, even though we find out in the next episode that it was for pretty justified reasons. Thankfully, Moxie and Millie managed to stand up for all of them and get those lustful losers off their backs. Things end with all of them, or at least Eminem, getting a happy ending, complete with an unironic and kind of cheesy and then everyone clapped moment. But I think what this song does best is show how the cast really is viewed by the rest of Hell. Moxie's seen as a lame moron for simply having desires outside of lust, finance, and money. Blitz is seen as a pathetic, selfish bad guy who can't do anything right. And Stolas is seen as a washed-up celebrity who should be doing better than he is now. This song reveals how most of the main cast members are genuinely outcasts from the rest of Hell. But this episode isn't just important because of the song, but because of the aftermath too. After the song, we get a scene that I could explain, but I think the best choice here would be to let it speak for itself.
We could talk, or watch a movie, or maybe cuddle.
Stolas, don't act like what we have is anything but you wanting me to fuck you, okay? You make that really clear all the time. But I can't do it tonight, okay? I'm sorry.
Okay. Good night, Blitz.
Night.
Just wow. I know that this relationship, like I said, has some problems among the fandom, but this is one scene that I think everyone can agree hits hard. The back-to-back of Stolas wanting to be with Blitz but getting rejected, with Blitz wanting love in his life but not believing anyone can love him, it's just tragic. And when you take this with what we saw in the song, and how both Blitz and Stolas are seen as outcasts and pathetic beings by the demons around them, it makes it so easy to picture them being happy together, and sad to know that they're not together. It's moments like these that make you care about these characters and, more importantly, what happens to them. Ozzy's does feel relatively light on Helluva Boss charm, but it makes up for it with some of the most intense drama the series has to offer. And the best part? This is only one half of Blitz's and Stolas' relationship. The other half, well, you'll get to see it for yourself right now. Any good relationship worth getting invested in needs to have a good start. If you don't know who someone is or why they like someone else, then why should you care about what happens to them? Most people point to lazy rom-coms and how they force two people who are clearly bad for each other together, as evidence for why writers should develop their characters. But frankly, it's a trap any writer can fall into. I'm so thankful Helluva Boss didn't fall into it. The plot around Blitz and Stolas and Ozzy's was about the relationship in the present. But what about their past? How deep does their romance go? Well, a little too deep if you ask me. Well, only a little anyway. I kind of have mixed feelings on the Circus, which I know sounds odd cause, it's this high on the list, but I can explain. I do genuinely like the story this episode tells. I like how Blitzo and Stolas have similar problems and how they manage to find a way to help each other out with their own personal issues. However, my personal issue comes from this story being a part of the show's story. I think that revealing Blitzo and Stolas were childhood friends is kind of a cheap way to set up how they became partners in the first place. I mean, it works, I'm not saying that this story subtracts from their relationship in any way, but it does feel kind of unrealistic. I feel like they worked better when we didn't know that they knew each other in childhood. Before this episode, it just seemed like Stolas took a liking to Blitz because he just wanted a little more excitement in his life. It felt more realistic that he would do what he did with a complete stranger because things with his wife weren't working out and he wanted to try and find some greater happiness in his life. I don't know, it's just my opinion, but I feel like including this lore kind of cheapened the two of them as a couple. But when you look at this episode in a vacuum, independent from the rest of the show, I think it's an unironically passionate piece of animation. I feel like the concept of Helluva Boss babies allowed the crew to explore a lot of possibilities that they couldn't do with just any episode. Not just with the characters we know, but also with the characters we didn't know. Even though this is the only time we see the fathers of Blitz and Stolas, you can instantly tell who they are, a neglectful dad of a politician and a manipulative con man. It's almost too easy to understand why Blitz and Stolas turned out the way they did when you see who raised them. Kid Blitzo and Owlet Stolas have good chemistry as children. I won't go into too much detail since this video is already pretty long, but they both act and play how actual kids do. I don't use the term cute all that often, but yes, the scenes with them are enjoyably cute. Plus it's a bonus that there's no third act breakup where Stolas realized that Blitzo was robbing his family. The entire heist is treated as a way to get Blitzo to meet Stolas and to have them bond over an activity. That's it. No extra drama, just an explanation of how they met and how they grew to like each other, even if that doesn't show too much in the present day. I also want to mention young Fizzaroli because even though he doesn't have a big role in this episode, it's just depressing to know that he went from Blitzo's brother to Blitz's bully. The past sequence is a really good part of this episode, but the main event starts 25 years later with Stolas and what he goes through with his wife. The affair between Blitz and Stolas just seemed like Stolas having desires that were a little too adventurous, but this episode reveals that it goes deeper than that. As this episode shows us, Stolas isn't just some weird thirsty owl. He's a sad, broken creature who is forced to marry a complete Karen for the sake of his father, and his marriage resulted in nothing but insults from his heartless wife and total misery in his life. It wasn't until he mistaked Blitz for genuinely wanting him and being dealt with real fast that he finally got the courage to tell his wife that he wanted a divorce. Only, the divorce wasn't instant. The scene where Stolas finally snaps at Stella and tells her to get out of his life feels genuinely realistic. Not realistic as in realistic for this world or anything, but like a genuine conversation partners have with each other when they're just done.
I tried so many years to make it comfortable for us, to have this family, but it was never enough. The only reason I have endured your constant insults and cruelty was for that girl to have a normal life. I cannot do this anymore. I want you out, now.
Look, I know Helluva Boss is supposed to be a comedy, and that I've been ignoring a lot of the more comedic aspects of these episodes. But the truth is, I really do think that no amount of praise to the charm or jokes of the show can make moments like these deserve my attention any less. The circus is definitely this show's black sheep to me. But just because something doesn't belong doesn't mean it's also wrong. It's a tragic tale with a bittersweet end, and arguably one of Stolas' best appearances and character arcs. There's only one more to go, so I won't delay the inevitable. You know, it's funny. There is probably a million ways I could introduce this last episode, but I think that for where we're headed, it can just introduce itself.
Where am I? Whoa!
Hey, this is my territory, bitch! Take your shitty costume and get the fuck off my corner!
I'm charmed already. I know it's strange to end things off on an Octavia-centered episode after spending this entire list going over the rest of the cast, but you know what? I genuinely think that this is the best episode of Helluva Boss, if not because of Octavia. Despite being a part of the main cast, she's only had 2 episodes so far centered around her. And while Lululand is definitely a great episode in its own right, I seriously think that this is a much deeper analysis of Octavia and what her life is like. But before I get to her, I think I should go over everything else. Build up to it, you know? First, there's the concept. The sleazy, urine-soaked concept. I'll admit that the setup is really clever, but I do think the main motivation behind making this episode was to put the cast in LA and make fun of even the literal demons called Hell on Earth. But I am not faulting the show for that, not at all, because the script here takes full advantage of the unique situation. I thought that the jabs at Hollywood culture were pretty funny, and the ways the characters interacted with their environments felt organic and natural. LA is a lot of things, but uninteresting is not one of them. Next, M&M. I really liked their C plot in this, mainly because the C stands for comedic. Admittedly, I thought I was going to dread watching Moxie boss his wife around by useless junk passing itself off as fine art, but first, most of that takes place off screen, and second, it ends in a really funny punchline. After them, there's Blitz and Stolas. While I can't act like I'm a huge fan of the whole character gets mistaken for a celebrity and has to star in a movie trope, their plot isn't really about that, but rather their feelings towards their respective daughters. While there are episodes that show how deep the similarities between Blitz and Stolas are, this episode focused on a good surface level similarity, in that they both care about their daughters and don't want them to go through the same pains they've gone through. It felt appropriate to call this similarity out since this was an Octavia-focused episode. Which brings me to, no pun intended, the star of this episode, Octavia. I feel like her journey throughout these 21 minutes feels realistic, but not in a sad way like with a lot of the other episodes on this list. Rather, it feels realistic in an honest and very optimistic way. What I like most about her arc here is that it isn't started by another character's malice or pettiness towards her. She simply had a misunderstanding with her father which led her to thinking that he didn't love her as much as he hated her mother. There wasn't even a villain of the week or anything to persuade her into thinking that her father didn't like her anymore. She simply acted out of impulse and emotion and ended up making a stupid choice. What ultimately made Octavia come around wasn't any risky stun or dangerous situation. It was just Luna reassuring her that her father does care about her, and that he spent the entire day looking for her. Not to mention the scene where she does reunite with Stolas and explain to him what she thought was going on is genuinely wholesome. And her not getting to see the meteor shower but getting to see a fireworks show instead felt like a great place to end things off. I know I'm mostly praising this episode on the basis that it's realistic even though it's a show about fictional demons, but that's just the thing. Helluva Boss is really good at being, well, real. I'm not advocating for this show to be as close a reflection of reality as possible. There are tons of great moments it wouldn't have to offer if it did try to be that. But when it tries to take itself seriously and tell a compelling, emotional story about these characters, more often than not, it succeeds. Seeing Stars is a prime example of one of those successes. It doesn't try to sugarcoat Octavia's situation as something better than what it is. It just shows a normal teen trying to escape a bad situation for a day, and the emotional reconciliation it leads to with her father. If that's not realistic, then I guess I don't know what reality is. I feel inclined to make a joke, but I think there's too many options for me to choose from, so I'll leave this one up to you. Seeing Stars isn't technically the best episode, but it's my favorite for a reason, and that it's my favorite story this show has told so far. I know that some people look for different things in Helluva Boss, but for me personally, I look for inspiring character arcs and sincere advice. You can disagree with me about whether or not this episode has the best in both those categories, and while I believe that this episode doesn't necessarily try harder to leave an impact on the viewer, it succeeded in doing just that, more than any other episode so far. All in all, Helluva Boss is definitely unique among online animations in that it is arguably one of the most professional series, on all fronts, to be made online. You could genuinely pass it off as something that airs on Adult Swim or a streaming service. But one difference between it and a lot of the big time shows out there is that it tries. And no matter how you spin it, effort can't be viewed as anything but a noble positive. This show might be about demons, but it cares about being good.